Queen Victoria was a secret widow who sought solace from mediums behind the closed doors of the British court, hoping to reconnect with her beloved husband. What did she talk about with the spirits? How did spiritualism influence the most important decisions of the empire? Why did her contemporaries believe that the power of the monarchy was fueled by the spirit world? We will reveal the secret that changed history and the fate of the royal court. If you want to learn more secrets about the royal family, subscribe to our channel, like the video, and be sure to write in the comments whether you believe that the decisions of the British court could really have been made after communicating with spirits. London, 1852. A new craze is sweeping through the aristocratic salons of the British capital. Behind the heavy curtains of Mayfair mansions, ladies in crinolines and gentlemen in top hats gather. They sit around round tables, turn off the lights, and join hands. A séance begins. Victorian England is experiencing a real boom in spiritualism, which has swept through all strata of society, from working-class neighborhoods to the royal chambers. It all started in America a few years earlier. The Fox sisters from New York State claimed they could communicate with the spirits of the dead through a system of knocks. Their séances caused a sensation, and the fashion for spiritualism instantly spread across the ocean. By the mid-19th century, there were tens of thousands of committed spiritualists in Great Britain. They formed societies, published magazines, and held public demonstrations of contact with the other world. Victorian society proved surprisingly receptive to the idea of communicating with the dead. There were several reasons for this. First, the era was characterized by high mortality. Diseases took people in the prime of life, and infant mortality reached appalling levels. Almost every family experienced the loss of loved ones. Second, traditional religion was in crisis. The scientific discoveries of Darwin and geologists undermined belief in biblical truths. Spiritualism offered a compromise between faith and science, promising proof of the existence of the soul and the afterlife. Mediums became stars of Victorian society. Daniel Douglas Humm demonstrated levitation and the materialization of spirits. Florence Cook allegedly summoned the ghost of a girl named Katie King. Seances turned into real performances with music coming from nowhere, moving objects, and voices of the dead. Skeptics explained it all away as trickery, but believers refused to listen to rational arguments. The scientific community was divided. Some scientists rejected spiritualism as fraud and superstition, but there were also those who tried to study the phenomenon seriously. Chemist William Crookes, who discovered thallium, conducted a series of experiments with mediums and declared the reality of paranormal phenomena. Physicist Oliver Lodge also leaned toward recognizing the existence of spirits. This gave spiritualism respectability in the eyes of the educated public. The Church of England had mixed feelings about the new craze. Officially, priests condemned attempts to summon the dead as ungodly. But some clergy saw spiritualism as confirmation of the Christian teaching of the immortality of the soul. Hybrid forms of religiosity emerged, combining spiritualist practices with Christian faith. Victorians sought solace wherever they could find it. The press actively covered spiritualist séances. Newspapers published sensational reports about contacts with great people of the past. The magazine Spiritualist was published regularly and had thousands of subscribers. Books were published describing techniques for communicating with spirits. The literature of the time reflected the general enthusiasm. Dickens wrote about ghosts, and Conan Doyle later became a convinced spiritualist. Spiritualism knew no class boundaries. Cheap seances were held in working-class areas, where for a few pence you could try to contact a deceased relative. In aristocratic salons, invited mediums entertained guests after dinner. The middle class organized home circles where family members themselves tried to summon spirits using special boards and tables. Women were particularly drawn to spiritualism. In patriarchal Victorian society, they had few opportunities for self-realization. The role of medium gave women power and attention. Great spirits supposedly spoke through them, and men listened to them. Many famous mediums were women, and this was no coincidence. Spiritualism provided them with a space where they could influence what was happening. By the end of the 1850s, spiritualism was firmly rooted in British culture. Seances became commonplace. Thousands of people regularly attempted to communicate with the dead. The skepticism of part of society only fueled interest. Exposes of fraudulent mediums did not kill belief, but gave rise to a search for genuine contact with the other world. But no one could have imagined that this craze would reach the highest echelons of power, that behind the closed doors of royal residences, the same seances would take place, that the ruler of the greatest empire in human history would seek advice from spirits, and that this craze would affect the lives of millions of people around the world. The Victorian era held many secrets, and one of the most intriguing was connected with Queen Victoria herself. But before we can understand how the monarch became involved in the world of spiritualism, we need to learn about the tragedy that turned her life upside down, about the loss that drove the Queen to seek solace in communicating with the dead. What grief could have caused the ruler of an empire to turn to mediums? December 14, 1861, forever changed Queen Victoria's life. On that day, her beloved husband, Prince Consort Albert, died at Windsor Castle. He was only 42 years old. The cause of death was typhoid fever, although modern researchers suggest that the disease may have been exacerbated by chronic health problems. For Victoria, it was a catastrophe from which she never recovered. Victoria and Albert were married in 1840, when she was 20 years old. It was a rare case of a royal love match. The young queen fell in love with the handsome German prince at first sight. Albert reciprocated her feelings, albeit more reservedly. During their 21 years of marriage, they had 9 children. But more importantly, Albert became not just Victoria's husband, but her support, advisor, and the only person she trusted completely. The prince consort effectively ruled the country alongside the queen. He prepared documents, met with ministers, and formulated political decisions. Victoria relied on his judgment in everything. Albert was a man of exceptional intelligence, progressive views, and organizational talent. It was he who initiated the Great Exhibition of 1851, which brought Britain enormous profit and prestige. His influence on politics was enormous, albeit unofficial. When Albert died, Victoria plunged into mourning, from which she never fully emerged. She ordered that all his belongings be kept exactly as they had been during his lifetime. Every evening, servants brought hot water to his room for washing and laid out fresh clothes. as if the prince might return at any moment. This was not simply a tribute to his memory. Victoria was psychologically unable to come to terms with her loss and created the illusion that Albert was still with her. The Queen donned a mourning dress and wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years. She withdrew from public life, refused to appear at official events, and practically did not perform her royal duties. The government and the public began to grumble. There was talk of a possible abdication. Britain needed a queen, not a grieving widow locked up in a castle. But Victoria did not respond to the criticism. The monarch's psychological state caused serious concern among her loved ones. She fell into a deep depression. Doctors feared for her sanity. Victoria cried constantly, refused to eat, and suffered from insomnia. She said she wanted to die and be reunited with Albert. Her children could not comfort their mother. The courtiers did not know how to behave. The whole country watched the Queen's condition with concern. In this desperate state, Victoria sought any way to feel a connection with her deceased husband. She read and reread his letters, spent hours looking at portraits, and visited places where they had been together. But that was not enough. The Queen craved real contact, the opportunity to hear Albert's voice and get his advice. It was at this moment in her life that spiritualism appeared, promising what she so desperately desired. The Victorian era was a time when belief in the possibility of communicating with the dead was considered quite respectable. Many educated people saw nothing reprehensible in it. Moreover, spiritualism seemed almost scientific, as renowned scientists were engaged in its study. For the grief-stricken Queen, the idea that she could talk to Albert was incredibly appealing. It gave her hope that death had not separated them forever. Victoria did not become interested in spiritualism immediately after her husband's death. For the first few years, she was too immersed in despair to do anything. But by the mid-1860s, when the sharpness of her grief had dulled somewhat, the Queen became more receptive to ideas about the possibility of contact with the afterlife. There were people at court who cautiously spoke to her about it. It is important to understand that for Victoria, turning to spiritualism was not a rejection of the Christian faith. She remained a devout woman and the head of the Anglican Church. The Queen did not perceive seances as something contrary to religion, but rather as a complement to it. Many Victorians thought the same way. They believed that communicating with spirits confirmed the existence of the afterlife and thus strengthened their faith. The decision to try to contact Albert through mediums was an act of both desperation and love for Victoria. She was willing to do anything to somehow reconnect with the person most dear to her. Royal power, wealth, and empire meant nothing to her without Albert. If there was even the slightest chance of hearing him again, she had to try. And she tried, despite all the risks to her reputation and the authority of the monarchy. Thus began a secret chapter in the life of Queen Victoria, about which little was known to the general public for a long time. A chapter that sheds new light on the monarch's personality and shows how strong her grief was. But who exactly introduced the Queen to the world of spiritualism? How did she find her first mediums? And what happened at those secret seances behind the closed doors of the royal residences? Queen Victoria's first encounter with spiritualism did not come through a professional medium, but thanks to the curiosity of the ladies of the court. In the mid-1860s, Spiritualist seances became a fashionable pastime in aristocratic circles. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting, wanting to distract her from her endless mourning, told her about amazing cases of communication with the dead. They described how mediums conveyed accurate details from the lives of the deceased that they could not have known by ordinary means. Victoria was initially skeptical about these stories. She was intelligent enough to understand the possibility of fraud. But the ladies-in-waiting were persistent. They spoke of respectable people, including scientists and priests, who believed in the reality of spiritual phenomena. Gradually, the Queen's defenses began to weaken. The desire to hear something from Albert was too strong to ignore even a remote possibility. The first séance was organized in strict secrecy in one of the remote rooms of Windsor Castle. It was more of an experiment than a serious attempt to establish contact. Only the most trusted ladies-in-waiting and a mediocre medium who practiced in London were present. Victoria sat down at the table with mixed feelings of hope and fear. What if it worked? What if she really heard Albert's voice? The séance was conducted according to the classic spiritualist protocol of the time. The participants sat around the table and held hands. The lights were turned off, leaving only a single candle burning. The medium went into a trance, his breathing becoming heavy and irregular. Then there was a knocking on the table, supposedly answering questions. One knock meant yes, two meant no, and three meant unknown. The spirits supposedly communicated through this primitive system. The Queen asked questions that only she and her late husband knew the answers to. The medium gave answers through knocks. Some were strikingly accurate, which shocked Victoria. Skeptics later explained this as lucky guesses, and the fact that the medium could have obtained information about the royal couple in advance. But at that moment, in the dimly lit room, overcome with emotion, Victoria wanted to believe. And she believed that it could really be Albert. After the first session, the Queen ordered another, more serious one to be organized. This time, a well-known London medium with a good reputation was invited. The session was conducted with even greater precautions. All participants swore to keep the secret. Victoria did not want the public, or worse, her political opponents, to find out about her obsession. Even the Prime Minister was not privy to what was happening. At the second séance, the phenomena were more impressive. The table allegedly moved on its own. Loud knocks were heard on the walls, and a candle went out and lit up again for no apparent reason. The medium spoke in a changed voice, claiming that the spirit of Prince Albert was speaking through him. The messages were full of love and assurances that Albert was watching over Victoria from the afterlife. The Queen wept with happiness and relief. It is important to understand Victoria's psychological state at that time. She was desperate and lonely, despite being surrounded by courtiers. No one could replace Albert for her. The séances gave her the illusion that the connection was not lost, that he could still guide her. It was the comfort she needed most in the world. The rational part of her mind may have had doubts, but the emotional part craved belief. The sessions began to be held regularly, about once every 2 to 3 weeks. Victoria kept a diary where she recorded some of the messages she received from Albert's spirit. These records are extremely rare in the surviving documents, as the Queen was very cautious. But some fragments have nevertheless come down to us through the memoirs of courtiers written many years later. They mention the sessions, albeit without details. Gradually, the circle of initiates expanded, but remained very small. Some high-ranking courtiers knew about the Queen's spiritualist pursuits, but kept silent. There was an unspoken agreement not to discuss it publicly. Victoria enjoyed enormous authority among those close to her, and no one dared to criticize her methods of coping with grief. Moreover, some became interested in spiritualism themselves and began attending seances outside the royal court. Were these first seances genuine contacts with the other world or clever deception? Modern science categorically rejects the possibility of communication with the dead. All spiritualist phenomena are explained either by fraud or psychological effects. 19th-century mediums used a variety of tricks to create illusions. Hidden assistants made sounds, chemicals glowed in the dark, and ventriloquism imitated the voices of spirits. But that didn't matter to Victoria. She got what she was looking for: hope and comfort. The reality of spiritualist contacts was less important to her than emotional relief. The Queen felt connected to Albert again, and that gave her the strength to go on living and ruling. Most importantly, she was about to meet a man who would change her life and cause a scandal at court. Who was this mysterious Scotsman who had such an incredible influence on the Queen? In 1864, a man appeared in Queen Victoria's life who would cause more rumors and gossip than anyone else at court. John Brown was a simple Scottish servant who worked as a groom at Balmoral, the royal family's summer residence in Scotland. Albert loved Balmoral and often took Brown with him on hunting trips and walks. After the prince's death, Victoria increasingly turned to this sturdy Scotsman, seeing in him a living link to her late husband. John Brown was the complete opposite of the elegant courtiers. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a red beard and a strong Scottish accent, he knew nothing of court etiquette and had no desire to learn. Brown spoke to the Queen directly, sometimes even rudely, calling her simply a woman. Any other servant would have been dismissed for such familiarity, but Victoria not only tolerated it, but seemed to appreciate his sincerity. The Queen made Brown her personal servant in Scotland, and then transferred him to Windsor and other residences. His duties quickly expanded far beyond those of a typical servant. Brown accompanied the Queen everywhere, controlled access to her, and relayed her orders. In fact, he became something of a personal secretary, which was unheard of for a man of his background. The court grumbled, but Victoria ignored the criticism. The relationship between the Queen and her Scottish servant became the subject of endless speculation. Malicious tongues claimed that there was a romantic connection between them. Rumors of a secret morganatic marriage began to circulate. Victoria began to be called Mrs. Brown, which was extremely offensive to the monarch. Satirical magazines published caricatures depicting the Queen in an unflattering light alongside Brown. The scandal threatened to undermine the authority of the monarchy. In fact, there is no reliable evidence of a romantic relationship between Victoria and Brown. Their connection was probably more complex and profound than simple attraction. Brown represented for the Queen a connection to a simpler, more honest world, far from the intrigues of the court. He was also the last person who knew Albert closely, which made him especially valuable to Victoria. But there was another reason for Brown's enormous influence, one that few suspected. John Brown had a reputation for having unusual abilities. In Scotland, he was believed to have second sight, a gift of foresight traditionally attributed to some Scots of Celtic descent. Brown was said to be able to sense danger, see omens, and communicate with nature spirits. In the superstitious atmosphere of Victorian Scotland, this did not seem implausible. Many Highlanders believed in the existence of a parallel world of fairies and ghosts. Queen Victoria, who was fascinated by spiritualism, could not help but be interested in Brown's abilities. There is evidence, although not officially confirmed, that Brown participated in some of the Queen's séances. Moreover, some historians suggest that he may have acted as a medium, helping Victoria communicate with Albert's spirit. This would explain her exceptional attachment to her Scottish servant. Imagine the scene. In a dimly lit room at Balmoral or Windsor, the Queen and her faithful servant are sitting. Brown enters a trance-like state. His voice changes, and he begins to speak on behalf of the late prince. The messages contain intimate details known only to Victoria and Albert. The Queen cries, asks questions, and receives answers. For her, this is a sacred moment of communication with her beloved husband. To an outside observer, it might have looked like manipulation. Was Brown sincerely convinced of his abilities, or was he deliberately deceiving the Queen? Both are possible. Many 19th century mediums believed in their own powers, even if they used tricks to enhance the effect. Auto-hypnosis and self-suggestion could have made Brown truly feel that someone else was speaking through him. On the other hand, he may have understood that the Queen desperately needed comfort and gave her what she wanted to hear. Brown's influence on Victoria became so strong that the courtiers became seriously concerned. The Scottish servant could influence the Queen's decisions, including political ones. There are stories of how Brown dissuaded Victoria from certain actions and encouraged others, supposedly conveying the will of Albert's spirit. It is difficult to say how true this is, but the very fact that such rumors existed shows the extent of his influence. John Brown died in 1883 of erysipelas. Victoria was devastated. She ordered a monument to be erected to her servant, which was unheard of. The Queen wrote a memoir about him, which caused a scandal among her relatives and the court. Her affection for a simple Scotsman remained a mystery to many. But when you consider his possible role in the Queen's spiritualist practices, everything becomes clearer. The story of John Brown shows how deeply spiritualism penetrated Queen Victoria's personal life. It was not just a passing fancy or a tribute to fashion. For her, communicating with the other world became a way to survive grief and find meaning in life after Albert's death. And Brown was perhaps a key figure in this process, but he was not the only medium with whom the Queen dealt. There were other, more professional practitioners who visited the royal court in the strictest secrecy. In addition to John Brown, Queen Victoria had contacts with several professional mediums who secretly visited the royal court. Organizing these visits required extreme caution. The mediums were brought in a carriage with drawn curtains and led through side entrances to avoid meeting the main staff. Even many courtiers were unaware of the presence of these mysterious visitors in the royal residences. One of the first known mediums to work with the Queen was Daniel Douglas Hume. He was the most famous spiritualist of his time, a Scotsman by birth who performed throughout Europe. Hume demonstrated amazing phenomena such as levitation, the movement of objects without touching them, and the materialization of spirits. He was never caught cheating, which gave him a special reputation. Renowned scientists, including chemist William Crookes, confirmed the reality of his abilities. Hume was invited to the court through intermediaries in the late 1860s. The séance was held in the presence of only a few trusted individuals. According to rumors preserved in memoirs, Hume demonstrated to the Queen the levitation of a table and the sounds of an accordion playing without any visible performers. But the main thing was the message from Prince Albert that the medium conveyed to Victoria. The content of this message remained a secret, but the Queen was deeply moved. Another medium whose name is associated with the royal court is Charles Williams. He specialized in materializing spirits in the form of visible ghostly figures that appeared during séances. Williams conducted his séances in complete darkness, which allowed him to use various tricks. Skeptics claimed that his spirits were assistants dressed in white robes covered with luminescent paint. But for believers, including, perhaps, the Queen, these were the real souls of the dead. There are unconfirmed stories that during one of Williams's sessions, the spirit of Prince Albert allegedly materialized. A ghostly figure appeared in the dim light in the corner of the room, reached out to Victoria, and uttered a few words. The Queen tried to get closer, but the figure melted away. Victoria wept, believing she had seen her beloved husband. Critics pointed out that in the dark and in a state of emotional excitement, people see what they want to see. Not all of the mediums invited to court were men. Mrs. Marshall, a well-known London spiritualist, also allegedly visited Windsor. She specialized in automatic writing. Spirits allegedly guided her hand as she wrote messages. Marshall could write a page of text in minutes without looking at the paper. The messages contained advice, consolation, and sometimes specific recommendations on matters of state, supposedly coming from Albert. It is important to note that Victoria was not the only member of the royal family interested in spiritualism. Her daughter, Princess Louise, also attended séances. Several other relatives showed curiosity about this phenomenon. Spiritualism in the Victorian era was so widespread among the upper classes that the royal family was simply following the general trend. The only difference was that Victoria had special reasons for seeking contact with the dead. The mediums who worked with the Queen received generous remuneration and a promise of absolute secrecy. They were strictly forbidden to tell anyone about the séances at the palace. Most of them obeyed this rule during Victoria's lifetime. Only after her death did some of them decide to make cautious hints in their memoirs. The full details were never revealed. Historians have to piece together a mosaic from fragmentary references and indirect evidence. The quality of the mediums invited to court varied. Some were sincerely convinced of their abilities, while others were outright charlatans. The courtiers who organized the séances tried to weed out the most obvious frauds, but they were not always successful. Victoria herself, despite her desperate desire to believe, remained somewhat skeptical. She understood that they could be deceiving her, but she hoped to find genuine contact among the many fakes. One of the most intriguing aspects of spiritualist practices at court was the role of royal physicians and scientists. Some of them attended the séances as observers, trying to determine how real the phenomena were. Their records could shed light on what was happening, but most of these documents have either been lost or remain locked away in archives. Perhaps someday they will become available to researchers. Victoria's attitude toward mediums was She used them as a tool to achieve emotional comfort. The Queen did not idolize spiritualists or make them her advisors in the usual sense. They served a specific function of connecting her to Albert. When a medium ceased to be convincing, they were simply not invited back. It was a kind of market for spiritual services, where only the best gained access to the most high-ranking client in the empire. The secret mediums of the royal court remained in the shadows of history, but their influence on Victoria was significant. They gave her what neither doctors, priests, nor ministers could give her: hope of reuniting with her lost love. But among all these mediums, there was one whose story stands out in particular. A man who, according to some, had the most profound influence on the Queen, and whose connection to the court gave rise to legends that live on to this day. Robert James Lees, born in 1849, became one of the most mysterious mediums of the Victorian era. His name is most often associated with Queen Victoria, although there is very little documentary evidence of their meetings. Lees claimed to have had psychic abilities since childhood. At the age of 13, he allegedly accurately predicted the death of Prince Albert, which later attracted the attention of the Queen. Whether this is true or self-promotion is impossible to determine. According to legend, in 1863, the young Lees wrote a letter to the Queen in which he conveyed a message from Prince Albert. Victoria, overcome with grief, ordered that the boy be found. When Lees was brought to the palace, he allegedly conducted a séance during which Albert's spirit spoke through him. The Queen was shocked by the accuracy of the details, which only she and her late husband knew. From that moment on, a long collaboration between the medium and the monarch began. In his later years, Lees himself confirmed this story, claiming that he had regularly conducted séances for Victoria over many years. He said that the Queen called him the most convincing of all she had ever met. According to Lees, the sessions were held in the strictest secrecy, often attended only by himself, the Queen, and one or two trusted courtiers. No records were kept, and everything that happened remained between the participants. But how much can Lees's words be trusted? Historical documents from the royal archives contain no direct references to him. There are no payment records, no records of visits, no correspondence. Skeptics claim that Lees made up the whole story to become famous. Defenders argue that it is precisely the strict secrecy that explains the lack of documents. Victoria may have deliberately destroyed all traces of contact with the medium for fear of scandal. Lees was indeed a well-known medium in Victorian London. He held public séances, demonstrated telepathy and clairvoyance, and consulted private clients. His reputation was high enough to catch the attention of the royal court. Contemporaries described Lees as a charismatic man with a piercing gaze, capable of convincing anyone of his abilities. These qualities made him the ideal medium for the grieving Queen. One of the most intriguing stories associated with Lees concerns his alleged role in the investigation of the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. According to legend, Lees had visions of the killer and assisted the police. Moreover, he allegedly saw the killer in his visions and identified him as a well-known person, possibly even connected to the royal family. This story gave rise to numerous conspiracy theories about the Ripper's connection to the royal court. Let's return to Fox's relationship with the Queen. According to his stories, Victoria consulted with him not only on personal matters, but also on state affairs. The medium allegedly conveyed advice from Prince Albert on political decisions, ministerial appointments, and even foreign policy issues. This sounds fantastic, but such rumors circulated at court. Some courtiers whispered that Albert's spirit, through Lys, influenced the Queen more than the Prime Minister. How real was this influence? Most likely, greatly exaggerated. Victoria was an intelligent and cautious ruler. She was unlikely to make important political decisions based on the words of a medium, but she may have sought confirmation of her own inclinations in messages from Albert. If the medium said what Victoria wanted to hear, it reinforced her confidence in the correctness of her decision. Psychologically, it worked as self-persuasion. Lys claimed that he last conducted a séance for Victoria shortly before her death in 1901. The old queen allegedly wanted to make sure that she would soon be reunited with Albert in the afterlife. The medium assured her that the prince was waiting, and that the reunion would be joyful. Victoria died peacefully, believing in this promise. It's a beautiful story, but again, there's no documentary evidence to back it up. After Victoria's death, Lys wrote a memoir in which he described his relationship with the Queen in detail. However, the publisher refused to publish it, fearing lawsuits from the royal family. The manuscript allegedly exists somewhere in a private collection, but no one has seen its contents. Perhaps it is another fabrication by Lys himself, or perhaps it really does contain sensational revelations. We will never know for sure. Robert James Lee died in 1931 at the age of 82. Until the end of his life, he insisted on the veracity of his stories about working with Queen Victoria. His story remains one of the most controversial in the history of Victorian spiritualism. Was he truly the trusted medium of the greatest queen, or simply a talented hoaxer who used her name for his own glory? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Lys may have indeed conducted several séances for Victoria, but greatly exaggerated his role and influence. The Queen may have experimented with various mediums, including Lys, without attaching the importance to it that he did. Or perhaps the secrecy was so absolute that no traces remain. In any case, the legend of Lys and Victoria has become part of the Victorian myth. Regardless of the veracity of specific stories involving Lys, the fact remains that Queen Victoria was indeed interested in spiritualism and most likely participated in séances. This fascination could not help but influence her worldview and, possibly, some of her decisions. How deeply did spiritualism penetrate the politics of the British Empire? Could state affairs have been decided under the influence of messages from the other world? These questions deserve separate consideration. The question of the influence of spiritualism on Queen Victoria's political decisions remains one of the most controversial in historical science. There is no direct evidence that Victoria made state decisions based on séances, but there is more than enough circumstantial evidence and rumors to take this issue seriously. The Queen's contemporaries repeatedly mentioned in their diaries and letters the strange influence of invisible advisors on the monarch. Victoria had a constitutional duty to consult with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on all important matters. But she also wielded considerable personal power, especially in matters of appointments, awards, church affairs, and diplomacy. The Queen could insist on her opinion, and ministers usually yielded. If that opinion was influenced by spiritualist messages from Albert, the consequences could be significant. One of the most talked about cases concerns the appointment of Benjamin Disraeli as Prime Minister in 1868. Victoria had an inexplicable fondness for this politician, although many at court considered him too ambitious and unreliable. The Queen insisted on his appointment despite opposition. Rumors later spread that the decision was made after a séance in which Albert's spirit allegedly approved Disraeli as a worthy prime minister. Whether this is true or not, the relationship between Victoria and Disraeli was indeed unusually warm. The prime minister called the Queen a fairy and flattered her in every way possible. He intuitively understood how to deal with a monarch who was experiencing prolonged mourning. Disraeli never criticized Albert's memory. On the contrary, he constantly referred to the wisdom of the late prince. This created an atmosphere in which Victoria felt a sense of continuity with the times when Albert was alive. Another example is foreign policy toward Russia. Victoria had a strong dislike for the Russian Empire, especially after the Crimean War. This animosity intensified after 1861. Some historians suggest that the Queen considered Russia a spiritually dark force threatening Christian Europe. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, Victoria actively advocated for support for Turkey against Russia, which influenced the position of the British government. There is an unconfirmed story that during one of the séances, Albert's spirit warned of the Russian threat to India, the jewel in the British crown. Allegedly, after that, Victoria began to insist particularly strongly on strengthening India's defenses and countering Russian influence in Central Asia. The Great Game, the confrontation between Britain and Russia for control of the region, may have had, in addition to geopolitical reasons, a spiritualist subtext in the Queen's mind. The decision to proclaim Victoria Empress of India in 1877 is also surrounded by rumors. The idea came from Disraeli, but Victoria accepted it with enthusiasm. Some courtiers whispered that the Queen had received Albert's approval for this title. For her, becoming Empress was not just a political act, but almost a religious calling to continue the great mission that she and Albert had allegedly discussed during his lifetime. Less significant but numerous decisions about appointments to court positions, church posts, and awards could also be influenced by spiritualism. Victoria sometimes made unexpected choices that puzzled her ministers. When asked about her reasons, the Queen would vaguely refer to a feeling that it would be right, or the memory of the prince. Perhaps these words concealed messages received during séances. It is important to understand the psychological mechanism of this influence. Victoria was not a naive woman who blindly believed everything the mediums said. She used spiritualist séances as a way to clarify her own thoughts and feelings. When the medium conveyed Albert's advice, the Queen interpreted it through the prism of her own understanding of politics. If the advice coincided with her intuition, she accepted it. If it contradicted it, she ignored it. Nevertheless, even such selective influence could have consequences. The séances created the illusion for Victoria that Albert was still guiding her. This gave her confidence in decisions that might have been controversial or misguided. The Queen could stubbornly insist on her own way, believing that she was following the will of her late husband. Ministers found themselves in a difficult position. It was impossible to argue with the spirit of Albert. Was there a real danger to the state from the monarch's fascination with spiritualism? Most likely not. The British constitutional system of the 17th and 19th centuries had sufficient checks and balances. Parliament and the cabinet controlled the major decisions. The Queen's personal power was limited. Even if Victoria received political advice from mediums, she could not implement it without the consent of the government. But the psychological and symbolic impact was significant. Rumors of the Queen's spiritualist pursuits spread throughout society. Some saw this as a sign of her deep love for Albert, others as a symptom of mental instability. The authority of the monarchy could have suffered if the truth about the seances had become widely known. That is why the courtiers kept the secret so carefully. They were protecting not so much Victoria as the institution of the monarchy. The story of Queen Victoria and spiritualism shows the complexity of the relationship between the personal and the political in the life of a ruler. Even the monarch of a constitutional monarchy remains a human being with their own sorrows, hopes, and vulnerabilities. When personal grief is as intense as Victoria's after Albert's death, it inevitably affects one's entire life, including political activity. And if a ruler seeks solace in spiritualism, it becomes part of the political reality, whether we like it or not. Not everyone at court was sympathetic to the Queen's spiritualist pursuits. There was an influential group of skeptics who considered all spiritualism to be fraud and were concerned about the influence of mediums on Victoria. These people acted cautiously, realizing that open criticism of the grieving Queen was unacceptable. But behind the scenes, they tried to limit the medium's access to the court and dissuade Victoria from participating in the seances. One of the main skeptics was Sir Henry Ponsonby, the Queen's private secretary from 1870 to 1895. Ponsonby was a rational, educated, and perceptive man. He considered spiritualism to be a superstition unworthy of a monarch. In letters to his wife, Ponsonby expressed concern about the Queen's enthusiasms, although he maintained a tactful silence in her presence. The secretary subtly tried to prevent the sessions from being organized by creating bureaucratic delays. The royal physicians also expressed concern. They saw that the seances excited Victoria and caused emotional outbursts that could be harmful to the aging Queen's health. Dr. James Reed, Victoria's personal physician in her later years, cautiously suggested that she limit such practices. He argued this on medical grounds, avoiding direct criticism of spiritualism. Victoria usually ignored this advice. Members of the royal family were also divided in their opinions. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, treated his mother's spiritualism with ill-concealed skepticism. He considered it a fad that undermined the dignity of the monarchy. Edward tried to influence his mother, but Victoria rarely listened to her son, with whom she had a strained relationship. On the contrary, some of the Queen's daughters, especially Princess Louise, showed interest in spiritualism and even participated in seances. The Anglican clergy took an ambiguous position. Officially, the Church did not approve of spiritualism, considering attempts to summon the dead to be sinful. But the Queen was the head of the Anglican Church, and priests could not openly criticize her. Some court chaplains tried to gently guide Victoria toward more traditional forms of comfort, such as prayer, reading the scriptures, and church services. The effect was limited, as the Queen saw no contradiction between religion and spiritualism. An interesting case is that of Bishop Wilberforce, who had an audience with the Queen in the late 1860s. The bishop cautiously spoke about the dangers of spiritualism, referring to the biblical prohibition of necromancy. Victoria listened to him coldly and made it clear that she did not need such advice. After that, Wilberforce wrote to a colleague that the Queen was closed to reasonable arguments when it came to Prince Albert. This observation accurately reflected the situation. The British scientific community was mostly skeptical of spiritualism, although there were exceptions such as William Crookes. The Royal Society and other scientific institutions did not comment publicly on the monarch's interests, as this would have been inappropriate. But in private conversations, scientists expressed regret that a person in such a high position was succumbing to irrational beliefs. In their opinion, this undermined efforts to educate society. The Victorian press was cautious in its criticism of the Queen, but satirical publications sometimes published hints about her spiritualist interests. Cartoons depicted Victoria surrounded by ghosts or hinted at the influence of invisible advisors. These publications caused outrage among loyalists, but showed that rumors of seances at court were widespread enough to become the subject of satire. Skeptics at court also tried to discredit specific mediums. When a new spiritualist appeared claiming access to the Queen, opponents made inquiries. If evidence of fraud or a questionable reputation was found, this information was brought to Victoria's attention. Sometimes this worked, and unscrupulous mediums were not allowed into the court. But the problem was that it was impossible to distinguish a real medium from a fraudster. They all used similar methods. There was a danger that the scandal surrounding the Queen's spiritualism would become public and damage the monarchy. Skeptics at court understood this and acted not so much out of a desire to protect Victoria personally as out of a desire to protect the institution of the monarchy from discredit. They created an unspoken conspiracy of silence, in which even those who did not approve of the Queen's enthusiasms participated. The common interest required that the secret be kept. The confrontation between skeptics and supporters of spiritualism at court never escalated into open conflict. Everyone acted within the bounds of Victorian etiquette and court diplomacy. But the tension was there. The ladies-in-waiting who organized the seances and the courtiers who opposed them waged a quiet war. Victoria was at the center of this confrontation, but she remained independent, doing what she thought was right. Ultimately, the skeptics were unable to dissuade the Queen from spiritualism. Victoria continued to be interested in communicating with the other world until the end of her life. The skepticism of the courtiers was powerless against the force of her grief and her desire to maintain a connection with Albert. This shows that even in a constitutional monarchy, the personal beliefs of a ruler can be beyond the control of institutions. But it was in Scotland, far from the critical eyes of the London court, that Victoria's spiritualist practices reached their peak. Balmoral, a castle in the Scottish Highlands purchased by Victoria and Albert in 1852, held a special place in the Queen's heart. It was their shared dream of a secluded place away from the hustle and bustle of London, where the royal family could live a relatively simple life. After Albert's death, Balmoral became an almost sacred space for Victoria, filled with memories of happy times. And it was here that her spiritualist practices reached their peak. Scotland, with its ancient legends of ghosts, fairies, and nature spirits, created the perfect atmosphere for spiritualism. The locals believed in the existence of the afterlife much more than the inhabitants of English cities. Even educated Scots often retained the superstitions of their ancestors. Victoria felt that at Balmoral, the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner, that it was easier to make contact with Albert there. Psychologically, the atmosphere of the castle contributed to her belief. The séances at Balmoral were more frequent and more intimate than those at Windsor or Buckingham Palace. The Queen felt freer from court etiquette and critical glances in Scotland. Here she could fully indulge in her grief and search for comfort. John Brown, who was in his element, played a key role in organizing and conducting the séances. Some took place only in the presence of the Queen and a Scottish servant, without other witnesses. There are stories that at Balmoral, Victoria tried to use not only traditional spiritualist methods, but also Scottish folk practices. Brown allegedly taught her some Gaelic rituals for summoning spirits. On certain days, considered particularly auspicious according to the Celtic calendar, the Queen would go out to the heath and perform certain rituals there. It is impossible to say how true this is, but the mystical atmosphere of Balmoral made such stories plausible. The castle had several rooms associated with Albert, which Victoria kept untouched. His study, bedroom, and dressing room remained as they were during the prince's lifetime. The Queen would sit in these rooms for hours, lost in her memories. She claimed that she sometimes felt Albert's presence, heard his footsteps, and felt his touch. For skeptics, these were hallucinations of a grieving mind. For Victoria, they were reality. The Queen ordered many monuments dedicated to Albert to be erected in the Balmoral area. Pyramids of stones, obelisks, and statues marked places associated with their walks and hunts together. These monuments transformed the landscape into a kind of memorial space. Victoria regularly visited these places and talked to the monuments as if Albert could hear her. The line between memory and communication with the spirit became blurred. The staff at Balmoral was carefully selected. All the servants knew they had to keep what happened in the castle a secret. Many of them shared the superstitions of the Scottish Highlands and saw nothing strange in the Queen's spiritualistic practices. Some even helped organize séances, prepared special rooms, and brought the necessary items. Balmoral was an isolated world where Victoria's rules worked without interference. Guests at the castle sometimes witnessed unusual phenomena. Several courtiers recorded stories in their diaries about strange noises at night, moving shadows, and a feeling of presence. Skeptics explained this away as the old castle with its creaky floors and drafts, plus the suggestion of the atmosphere of mourning. Believers saw evidence that Balmoral was indeed inhabited by spirits, including Albert's. Victoria spent several months a year at Balmoral, especially in the fall. These were the months of most intense spiritualistic activity. The Queen declined many official duties, citing health reasons, and devoted her time to communicating with Albert. The government grumbled that the monarch was absent from the capital for too long, but Victoria was adamant. Balmoral was her refuge, and she had no intention of giving it up. Scottish mediums, familiar with the Celtic mystical tradition, were especially valued by the Queen during her stay at Balmoral. They spoke in a language of symbols and images close to Scottish folklore. Their séances differed from those in London in their more emotional, almost shamanic atmosphere. Victoria would slip into an altered state of consciousness, where the past and present, the living and the dead, all blended together. This gave her a deep, though illusory, sense of comfort. Balmoral became the center of Albert's spiritualist cult, practiced by Victoria. Here, the Queen felt closest to her late husband. The Scottish mountains, heaths, mists, and legends created a mystical atmosphere conducive to belief in the afterlife. At Balmoral, Victoria could be not the Queen of the British Empire, but simply a widow longing for her beloved husband and seeking to connect with him in any way possible. But did the Queen leave any written evidence of her spiritualist experiences? Did she keep records of the seances, the messages she received, her experiences? And if so, where are these documents now? These questions preoccupy historians trying to understand the true extent of Victoria's fascination with the afterlife. Queen Victoria was a prolific writer. She kept a daily diary for most of her life and wrote thousands of letters to relatives, ministers, and friends. After her death, she left behind a huge number of documents, many of which are kept in the royal archives. But what do these documents say about the Queen's interest in spiritualism? Is there any direct evidence of her participation in seances? The answers to these questions are ambiguous and contradictory. In Victoria's published diaries and letters, there are virtually no direct references to spiritualist seances. This could mean one of two things. Either the Queen never wrote about it, or the relevant entries were destroyed or removed from publication. Considering that Victoria wrote about everything in detail, including her most intimate experiences, the second option seems more likely. After the Queen's death, her daughter, Princess Beatrice, was tasked with editing her mother's diaries. Beatrice rewrote the diaries, removing what she considered too personal or unsuitable for publication. She destroyed the originals. This act of vandalism deprived historians of invaluable sources. We will never know what exactly the princess considered inappropriate, but it is quite possible that the records of spiritualist seances fell into this category. Beatrice protected the reputation of her mother and the monarchy, even at the cost of historical truth. Nevertheless, some indirect references have survived. In a letter to her eldest daughter, the Princess Queen of Prussia, Victoria wrote in 1865 about the unusual consolations she had found, and that she felt the presence of dear Papa, as she called Albert. Another letter mentions a man with amazing abilities who helped her feel the closeness of the departed. These vague phrases could refer to mediums, but they proved nothing. More direct evidence can be found in the diaries and letters of courtiers. Lady Augusta Bruce, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, wrote in her diary in 1867 about a strange evening when Her Majesty consulted a man who claimed to speak with the dead. The entry ends there, but it implies attendance at a séance. The memoirs of Earl Ponsonby contain a cautious reference to unusual sources of comfort and advice to which the Queen turned. An interesting document is a letter from the Queen to her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, written in 1864. Victoria writes, "I sometimes feel as if my beloved angel is still guiding me, sending me signs. I have learned to recognize these signs and follow them." What did she mean by signs? Messages received at séances, or simply a metaphor for the inner voice of conscience? Historians argue about the interpretation. A letter from Victoria to John Brown, written after one of his vacations in 1870, has also been preserved. The Queen writes, "I miss our special evenings. I feel lost without the opportunity." The rest of the text is blurred, the words illegible or deliberately smudged. Some researchers suggest that it was about the séances in which Brown participated as a medium. But this is only a guess. After John Brown's death in 1883, Victoria wrote a memoir about him that caused a scandal. Relatives were shocked that the Queen was publicly praising a servant. In these memoirs, Victoria described Brown as a man of remarkable intuition and special sensitivity to invisible influences. Modern readers might see this as a hint of mediumistic abilities, but Victorians were simply surprised by the unusual wording. The most intriguing story is connected with a letter allegedly discovered in the 20th century in a private collection. The letter is dated 1869 and addressed to an unknown medium. In it, Victoria thanks the addressee for the gift of communicating with my dear husband and asks for another séance to be arranged. The authenticity of the letter is disputed. The Royal Archives do not confirm its existence. It may be a forgery created for sensationalism. It is important to understand that the absence of written evidence does not mean that the events themselves did not take place. Victoria was smart enough not to leave compromising records of spiritualist séances. She understood that diaries and letters could be read by others, especially after her death. The Queen may simply not have recorded the most secret things. Oral tradition, rumors, and circumstantial evidence are sometimes the only sources of information about secret events of the past. The Royal Archives still contain closed sections to which access is strictly limited. Some historians suspect that documents shedding light on Victoria's spiritualist practices may be stored there, but the royal family is in no hurry to open these materials. Perhaps they believe that some of Victoria's secrets should remain secrets, protecting the memory of the Queen and the dignity of the monarchy. The diaries and letters that have come down to us provide only a fragmentary picture. They hint, intrigue, but do not provide definitive answers. Historians have to work like detectives, gathering clues from scattered sources. The full picture of Queen Victoria's spiritualist pursuits may never be pieced together. But even what we do know shows the depth of her grief and her desperate attempts to overcome the death that separated her from her beloved. How did British society react to rumors of the Queen's spiritualist pursuits? It's a difficult question to answer because most of her subjects never knew for sure about the séances at court. Officially, this information was never confirmed. But rumors existed, circulated in different strata of society, and provoked a wide range of reactions, from sympathy to outrage. Public opinion in the Victorian era was as diverse as the era itself. The middle class, which constituted a significant and growing part of the population, generally sympathized with the Queen. They saw in her the ideal of Victorian values: devotion to family, moral strictness, and a sense of duty. The story of her deep mourning for her husband touched their hearts. If the Queen sought solace in spiritualism, many members of the middle class understood this. After all, they themselves often attended séances, trying to contact deceased relatives. Victoria was one of them in her grief. The working class was less interested in the monarch's private life. For them, the Queen was a distant figure, a symbol of empire and power. Rumors of spiritualism had little effect on their attitude toward the monarchy. Workers were preoccupied with their own problems of wages, working conditions, and survival. The royal séances seemed to them to be the whims of the rich, unrelated to real life. However, there were also spiritualists among the workers, so some may even have approved of the Queen. The aristocracy and high society were divided in their opinions. Some considered the Queen's fascination with spiritualism to be an unfortunate weakness that should be forgiven because of her grief. Others saw it as a sign of instability that threatened the prestige of the monarchy. The gossip in London salons was not so much about the séances themselves as about the influence of certain people, especially John Brown. It was the Brown affair that most irritated the aristocrats. A commoner had gained access to the Queen that even noble lords did not have. The intellectual elite had mixed feelings about the rumors. Rationalist scholars regretted that the monarch was succumbing to superstition. Writers and artists saw in this a romantic image of the Queen, unable to survive the loss of her great love. Journalists cautiously hinted at the topic in their articles, but never wrote about it directly, fearing accusations of lèse-majesty. The Victorian press was more restrained than the modern press. The Church did not publicly comment on the Queen's private life, but priests sometimes warned about the dangers of spiritualism in their sermons, without naming specific names. Parishioners understood who they were talking about. Some vicars were more understanding, saying that it was acceptable to seek comfort in difficult times if it did not contradict one's faith. Religious debates about spiritualism often referred to the Queen as the most famous follower of this practice. The Republican movement, which existed in Britain even in the Victorian era, used rumors of spiritualism as an argument against the monarchy. If the Queen makes political decisions based on séances with the dead, is it reasonable to have a monarchy at all? These arguments did not gain widespread support, but they show that the topic was used for political purposes. The most active period of Republican sentiment was the 1870s, when Victoria did not appear in public for a long time. The scandal surrounding Mrs. Brown, a nickname given to the Queen by the newspapers for her dependence on her Scottish servant, was closely linked to suspicions of spiritualism. Many believed that Brown kept the Queen under her influence precisely through her mediumistic abilities. This made the situation even more scandalous. A servant medium controlling the Queen through alleged messages from her dead husband. For respectable Victorians, this was beyond the pale. Interestingly, public opinion changed over time. In the 1860s, immediately after Albert's death, Victoria was treated with great sympathy. Any of her actions were forgiven as manifestations of grief. But by the 1870s, society's patience was wearing thin. The Queen was supposed to return to her duties, but she continued to live in seclusion at Balmoral and Windsor. Rumors of spiritualism in this context were seen as proof that Victoria was not coping with her role as monarch. By the end of her reign, especially after her Golden and Diamond Jubilees, attitudes toward Victoria had softened. The old Queen became a symbol of an era, the beloved grandmother of the nation. The spiritualist pursuits of her youth were forgotten or viewed indulgently as the eccentricities of a bygone era. Society remembered not the séances, but the 64 years of her reign, the grandeur of the empire, and the stability and prosperity of the Victorian era. It is important to note that we do not have a complete picture of public opinion. Most ordinary people did not leave records of their views. We know the opinions of those who wrote diaries, letters, and articles of the educated elite. What ordinary farmers, workers, and shopkeepers thought about the Queen's spiritualism, if they thought about it at all, remains a mystery. Perhaps for most people it was completely irrelevant. Public opinion in Victorian Britain was multifaceted and contradictory, as was the attitude towards spiritualism in general. Queen Victoria was both an ordinary person experiencing grief and a symbol of the nation. Her private life became a subject of public interest, but the boundaries of decency limited the discussion. Rumors circulated, but there was almost no open criticism. This is a typical Victorian paradox. Everyone knows, but no one speaks aloud. The Victorian era was a time of scientific progress and rational thinking, but paradoxically also a time of flourishing pseudoscience and paranormal beliefs. The scientific community could not ignore the mass fascination with spiritualism and attempted to investigate the phenomenon from a scientific point of view. Were spiritualistic phenomena real or explainable by fraud and psychology? This question occupied the minds of some of the leading scientists of the time. In 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded in London. It was a serious scientific organization that included philosophers, physicists, psychologists, and other scientists. Its goal was to systematically study the paranormal phenomena of telepathy, clairvoyance, and communication with spirits. The society did not take the claims of mediums at face value, but did not automatically reject them either. The approach was empirical: to test, document, and analyze. One of the founders and active members of the society was Frederick Myers, a classical philologist and poet. Myers devoted years to researching spiritualism, trying to find scientific evidence of life after death. He attended hundreds of seances, interviewed mediums, and collected evidence. His monumental work, The Human Personality and Its Preservation After Bodily Death, was an attempt to create a scientific theory of the afterlife. Myers sincerely believed that he had found evidence, but most scientists remained skeptical. William Crookes, a famous chemist and physicist who discovered the element thallium and studied cathode rays, was also involved in the study of spiritualism. In the 1870s, Crookes conducted a series of experiments with the medium Daniel Douglas Hume. He claimed to have observed levitation under controlled conditions where fraud was impossible. Crookes published his findings in scientific journals, which sparked a storm of criticism. His colleagues accused him of not being rigorous enough in his experiments, or even of being deceived. Oliver Lodge, a physicist who contributed to the development of radio, also became fascinated with psychic research. After the death of his son in World War I, Lodge became a convinced spiritualist. He wrote the book Raymond, or Life and Death, in which he described his contacts with his son's spirit through a medium. The book became a bestseller, but also exposed Lodge to criticism from the scientific community. How could a serious scientist believe in such things? Most Victorian-era scientists rejected spiritualism. They explained the observed phenomena as a combination of fraud, self-deception, and poorly understood psychological effects. Mediums used tricks, and magicians and illusionists demonstrated how spiritual phenomena could be reproduced without the involvement of spirits. Tables moved thanks to the unconscious muscle movements of the participants in the séance. The voices of spirits were ventriloquism, and materialization was performed by hidden assistants in costumes. Psychology as a science was just emerging, but it already offered explanations for spiritualist experiences. Hallucinations, suggestion, and wishful thinking could all create the impression of contact with spirits. Grieving people are particularly susceptible to such illusions. Their desperate desire to connect with the dead makes them easy prey for fraudulent mediums or self-deception. Some researchers have uncovered outright fraud. Mediums have been caught using hidden mechanisms, accomplices, and fake materializations. Each such exposure undermined confidence in spiritualism, but believers responded that the existence of fraudsters did not disprove the reality of genuine mediums. They continued to search for genuine contacts among the many fakes. Scientific research into spiritualism continued into the 20th century. The Society for Psychical Research is still active today, although its focus has shifted. Modern science categorically rejects the possibility of communication with the dead. There is not a single case that has been confirmed under strictly controlled conditions. All paranormal phenomena have been given natural explanations or remain unexplained simply due to a lack of data, rather than being proof of the supernatural. But for Queen Victoria and millions of other Victorians, scientific debate was less important than emotional needs. They wanted to believe that death was not the end, that they would be reunited with their loved ones. Spiritualism offered this hope, regardless of what science said. In this sense, spiritualism served the same function as religion, providing comfort in the face of mortality. Interestingly, some ideas from spiritualism influenced the development of psychology. Research into trance, altered states of consciousness, and the unconscious grew largely out of attempts to understand mediumistic phenomena. Carl Jung, for example, began by studying seances. Thus, pseudoscience indirectly stimulated the development of real science. Scientific research was unable to prove or disprove spiritualism to everyone's satisfaction. Believers continued to believe, skeptics remained skeptical. Queen Victoria did not need scientific proof. Her belief was based on personal experience and emotional need. But what legacy did her spiritualist practices leave behind? Were the projects supposedly inspired by Albert's spirit brought to fruition? After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria devoted herself to preserving his legacy. She erected monuments, established scholarships, and supported projects that Albert had been interested in during his lifetime. But some of her decisions were rumored to be based on messages from Albert's spirit received during seances. How true are these rumors, and which specific projects could have been inspired by the afterlife? The most grandiose monument to Albert was the memorial in Kensington Gardens in London, unveiled in 1872. The giant Gothic monument with a statue of the prince over 40 meters high was one of the most expensive memorials in history. Victoria personally supervised every detail of the design. There are unconfirmed stories that some elements of the design were added at Albert's instruction, conveyed through a medium. Whether this is true or legend, it is impossible to determine. Albert Hall, a concert hall opposite the memorial, was another project in honor of the prince. The idea of creating a large cultural center belonged to Albert himself, and after his death, Victoria insisted on its implementation. The building opened in 1871. The Queen attended the ceremony, one of her rare public appearances in those years. She said that she was fulfilling the will of her late husband. Whether she received this will through a medium or simply remembered conversations with Albert is unknown. The Victoria and Albert Museum, one of the world's greatest art museums, is also linked to the prince's legacy. Albert was a passionate patron of the arts and sciences. He dreamed of creating educational institutions that were accessible to the general public. After his death, Victoria actively supported the development of what would become the V&A Museum, Every time she had to make important decisions about the museum, the Queen allegedly consulted with Albert's spirit. The Royal College of Music, founded in 1882, was another project that Victoria associated with Albert's wishes. The prince loved music, composed and played himself. Victoria believed that the creation of a top-level music college would have pleased him. Some courtiers whispered that the Queen had received Albert's approval for this project during a séance at Balmoral. Not all projects were so ambitious. Victoria established numerous scholarships and awards in Albert's name for students and scholars. She supported scientific research in areas that interested the prince, such as agriculture, engineering, and architecture. The Queen viewed each such decision as a continuation of Albert's work. Did séances influence the choice of specific areas? Perhaps, but there is no evidence. The story of the gardens and parks is interesting. Albert was a passionate gardener and landscape designer. He personally designed many elements of the gardens at Balmoral and Osborne House. After his death, Victoria continued to develop these gardens, adding new elements. She claimed that she was following plans that Albert had not had time to implement. How did she know these plans? From old notes or from communicating with his spirit? The question remains open. Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the royal couple's favorite residence, was turned by Victoria into a museum in memory of Albert. She kept everything exactly as it was during the prince's lifetime. His study, bedroom, even the clothes in his wardrobe remained untouched. Victoria spent a lot of time there, especially in the last years of her life. They say she felt Albert's presence there more strongly than anywhere else. Victoria also attributed some of her political decisions to Albert's influence from the afterlife. When she supported certain bills or appointments, the Queen sometimes referred to the fact that Albert would have approved. Ministers could not object to the opinion of the late prince consort, even if they suspected that Victoria was passing off her own desires as his will. It was a convenient rhetorical device used consciously or unconsciously by the Queen. Prince Albert's legacy and projects initiated after his death is enormous. Cultural, educational, and scientific institutions bearing his name continue to operate to this day. Victoria turned the memory of her husband into a driving force for real achievements. Were some of these decisions inspired by séances? Quite possibly. But more importantly, the results were very tangible and beneficial. Psychologically, Victoria needed to feel that she was continuing Albert's work under his guidance. Séances gave her that feeling. The reality of otherworldly contacts is less important than their psychological function. They allowed the Queen to act while feeling the support and approval of her beloved husband. In this sense, even if the séances were an illusion, they led to real and valuable results. The story of Albert's legacy shows a complex intertwining of grief, memory, power, and possibly spiritualism. Victoria used all the resources available to her, including her belief in communicating with the dead, to cope with her loss and continue to rule. Her methods may seem strange, but the results are impressive. How did the last years of the Queen's reign unfold? Did she continue to consult mediums until the very end? The last 2 decades of Queen Victoria's reign, from the 1880s to 1901, were a time of her resurgence as a public figure and the final cementing of her status as a symbol of the era. But did the aging Queen continue her fascination with spiritualism? The available evidence is contradictory, but suggests that her interest in communicating with the other world continued until the end of her days. After John Brown's death in 1883, Victoria lost what was perhaps her main intermediary in spiritualist practices. She was as grief-stricken as she had been after Albert's death. The Queen ordered a statue of Brown to be erected, wrote memoirs about him, and wore a ring with his portrait. Her relatives were shocked by the extent of her mourning for her servant. Some whispered that Victoria was now trying to contact the spirits of both Albert and Brown. A new servant, Abdul Karim, a Hindu who was given the title Munshi, teacher, became a close confidant. Karim taught the Queen Urdu and told her about Indian culture. Like Brown, he gained incredible influence over Victoria, which caused outrage at court. There are rumors that Karim also possessed mystical abilities in the traditions of Indian occultism and performed rituals for the Queen that differed from European spiritualism. There is no evidence of this, but the parallels with Brown are obvious. In the 1890s, Victoria returned to active public life. The Golden Jubilee in 1887 and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were grand celebrations. The old Queen became the darling of the nation, a symbol of stability and imperial grandeur. In public, she appeared as a respectable Victorian grandmother. But in her private life, according to rumors, she continued to be interested in spiritualism. The memoirs of some courtiers, published after Victoria's death, contain cautious hints about seances held in the 1890s. Lady Leighton, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, wrote about strange evenings at Windsor when Her Majesty communicated with the invisible world. Sir Frederick Ponsonby Jr., son of the private secretary, recalled mediums being secretly invited to the Aidh Palace. The details are always vague, there are no specifics, but the general picture is clear. Interestingly, in her later years, Victoria became more cautious in her spiritualistic experiments. Perhaps with age came a greater understanding of the risks to her reputation. Or perhaps her faith simply weakened after decades of unsuccessful attempts to make convincing contact. Some sources suggest that the Queen became disillusioned with many mediums, realizing that they were deceiving her. But the hope for genuine contact apparently never died completely. In 1899, the Anglo-Boer War began, becoming one of the last trials of Victoria's long reign. The war was difficult, and British troops suffered losses. The Queen publicly supported the army, but in private letters she expressed despair. There is an unconfirmed story that Victoria held a séance, asking Albert for advice about the war. Allegedly, the prince's spirit assured her of ultimate victory, which did indeed happen, although after the Queen's death, Victoria's health was deteriorating. In the last year of her life, she weakened, her eyesight almost disappeared, and she had difficulty moving around. Those around her were preparing for the inevitable. According to those close to her, the Queen was calm and ready to die. She often spoke of meeting Albert and Brown in the next world. These could have been simply the words of a dying Christian or a reflection of a belief reinforced by decades of spiritualist practices. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. One of the last words she uttered was Albert's name. 40 years after his death, she was finally reunited with him, at least in death. Victoria was buried next to her husband in the mausoleum at Frogmore. Her last will included many personal items to be placed in her coffin, including photographs and a lock of John Brown's hair hidden under flowers so that her family would not see it. After Victoria's death, many documents were destroyed or classified. Her son, King Edward VII, ordered the burning of his mother's correspondence with John Brown. Princess Beatrice edited the diaries. Abdul Karim was sent to India, his papers confiscated and destroyed. The new royal family wanted to control Victoria's legacy by removing anything that could cast a shadow on her reputation. Spiritualist pursuits clearly fell into this category. Victoria's later years reveal the complexity of her personality. Public triumph and private mystery, official grandeur and hidden grief. Until the end of her life, she remained a woman who had lost a great love and was looking for ways to cope with that loss. Spiritualism was one such way, perhaps the most important. Even as Empress and Grandmother of Europe, Victoria remained a widow longing to hear the voice of her late husband. But how does history judge her fascination with spiritualism today, more than a century after her death? The historical assessment of Queen Victoria's fascination with spiritualism has changed radically over the last 100 years. Early biographers either ignored this aspect of her life entirely or described it as the result of deep personal tragedy and enduring love. Contemporary historians see Victoria's spiritualist practices as a complex phenomenon that combines personal grief, religious exploration, cultural fads, and even the political interests of the era. Victoria became a symbol not only of the stability of the empire, but also of the human vulnerability of power, left alone as a widow. Her fascination with spiritualism illustrates how the personal drama of a monarch can influence the fate of a state. Spiritualism was not a capricious whim. It became a way to survive a terrible loss, restore emotional balance, and find support for new decisions in difficult circumstances. Many modern researchers tend to view Victoria's spiritualist experiences as a typical way of coping with grief for the era. In the 19th century, death was everywhere, and traditional religion could no longer provide clear answers to questions about the afterlife. Spiritualism, which arose at the intersection of faith and science, offered hope for continued relationships with the deceased and, consequently, meaning in life for the bereaved. Discussions about the influence of spiritualism on the politics of the British Empire are more speculative in nature. There is no direct evidence that the Queen made decisions solely under the influence of Albert's spirit. Rather, she used seances as a means of self-persuasion, channeling her own intentions through the myth of an otherworldly advisor. To understand her actions, it is important to consider the psychology of a widow, rather than look for mystical reasons. Historians agree on one thing: the Queen's personal drama, her inability to overcome her loss, and her constant search for any contact with her deceased husband made Victoria a living personality, not just a political symbol. Spiritualism became a spiritual support for her, a source of comfort, sometimes a tool for decision-making, but it never became the basis for state governance. Victorian England, which underwent a real spiritual revolution, left us a complex legacy. Queen Victoria, immersed in her inner world of mysticism, mourning, and memory, embodies the transition from tradition to modernity like no other. Her story teaches us to appreciate the power of human faith, even when that faith is directed toward the most hidden and contradictory corners of a monarch's life. More than a century has passed, and Victoria's personality and mysteries including her passion for spiritualism, continue to intrigue researchers and the public. Her life is not only a chronicle of a great power, but also a story of grief, hope, and the power to find meaning even where it seems to no longer exist. Queen Victoria remains the most mysterious widow of the British throne, inspiring not only biographers, but also millions of mourners around the world.